Welcome back. As President Trump makes claims of election fraud in California's primary election without offering any evidence, Democratic candidates fear it could offer a preview of what's to come in November's midterms and are preparing for the possibility that their own races could be challenged. Earlier this year, the president demanded that elections be nationalized and specifically called out Atlanta, Philadelphia, and Detroit for holding what he alleged to be rigged and crooked elections, again offering no evidence of fraud. Joining me now is Michigan's Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist, who is also running for Michigan Secretary of State. Thank you so much for joining us. There's just so much to discuss with you, but I do want to start with the election fraud claims, especially because the president has singled out Detroit before. What is your reaction to hearing these new claims that the president is making in regards to the LA mayor's race?
It's the same old with Donald Trump. As a Detroit voter, it is offensive to me that he always challenges election results that he doesn't like. And it's not an accident that he targeted black cities in particular. It's part of this broader project nationally, redistricting away black members of Congress. This is a generational assault on just votes, voting, and voters and democracy around the country. And we as Democratic leaders in states, we cannot stand for it. And frankly, as the next Secretary of State of Michigan, I won't stand for it. I won't tolerate, someone trying to usurp the Constitution, to take away our state's authority to manage and oversee our elections and make sure our voters can vote and have it count.
He also sued Michigan a number of times over the 2020 results. He's warned that legal threats could come in the future. What specific concerns do you actually have about what could potentially happen in the future?
They're certainly going to continue to be creative and aggressive legally, but I'm concerned about the fact that in 2020, Trump, his allies, they were literally banging on the windows and the doors where ballots were being counted in the city of Detroit. And I expect them to get, more violent and more dangerous. So we're preparing for those kind of realities with federal agents and just, again, people who are just doing Trump's bidding, coming in and trying to wreak havoc in Michigan.
How can you stop that? And are you prepared for the possibility of federal agents, for example, being sent into places like Detroit?
We certainly have the most aggressive legal strategy that you've ever seen, and I'll carry that forward to make sure that we can try to preempt any actions that they will take. But we're ready for people, community organizations, attorneys, but also sort of the state police, local law enforcement. We're ready to make sure that federal agents don't take away Michiganders' rights by standing in the way of them and their votes.
Is the legal aspect of this, is that enough, though, to stop something like this?
That's we need to meet them wherever they are. So when they brought people to try to, again, bang down the doors where people were getting their votes counted because they were so worried about how people in Detroit voted, then we have to meet them in the streets too.
This has become a part of your campaign for Secretary of State. And to be honest, I think 10 years ago, us covering something like a local Secretary of State race probably wouldn't have met the bar for national coverage. But it is because of these continued election fraud claims that the president continues to make. So in the race, you've defended the right to vote. But what does that actually look like to you, and how does that differentiate you from the other Democrats in the race?
Well, look, Michigan is a state that matters. We are decisive in terms of presidential elections, and who is running the election in Michigan in 2028 is the person who gets elected in 2026. And I'm going to make sure this stands tall for, again, votes and voting and voters and our democracy. And what sets me apart from my MAGA Republican opponent is he is a Secretary of State that will do whatever the president says to be responsible and accountable to the president, rather than being responsible and accountable to the 10 million people who call Michigan home, and responsible to our voters and making sure that they can have their constitutional rights protected. I will defend that legally. I will defend that using the bully pulpit of my office and telling the story and being just more clear and can tell the truth more aggressively than they're going to lie about the elections. We've seen how aggressive this president is lying about the election. He lies about the Detroit results more than any other election. He cannot tell the truth, but we can tell the truth more aggressively than they can.
You mentioned redistricting. There was a Supreme Court ruling that gutted the Voting Rights Act, enabling a lot of states, particularly in the South, to redistrict. Do you think that blue states should take advantage of that and redistrict in their own states?
I think that blue states have already tried to step up and to meet this moment and this challenge, and we have to fight this fire. I mean, look, they are specifically attacking not just Democratic seats, but Democratic seats that are held by black members of Congress, trying to gut the CBC as well. That is gutting the conscience of the Congress. That is not an accident. This is a moral threat to how our nation moves forward. And so, again, election officials have a responsibility. Democratic leaders in blue states have a responsibility. And in a state like Michigan, we're going to make sure we protect our voting rights.
I want to ask you about Michigan's Democratic Senate primary. There are 3 very different candidates in the race. I know you haven't weighed in, but there are some Democrats who are saying there's concern about electability, general election electability for some of these candidates, and that you elect someone too progressive or too far left, it's difficult to win in a state like Michigan. What is your response to that? Do you think there is a risk of elevating someone who's too far progressive and out of step with the general population?
I'm going to support who comes out of that Democratic primary so that we can win in November. And I believe who comes out of that primary is going to be someone who is directly responsive to the needs, concerns, and the energy of Michigan voters. So as a candidate for Secretary of State, I won our Democratic convention by pulling together a broad coalition of progressives, of business-minded, of young people, of seniors, a more broad coalition than anybody else been able to put together in Michigan. That coalition is the foundation of our victory in November. And that is grounded in the fact that as Lieutenant Governor, I've been to all 83 counties of Michigan at least 3 times, listened to people, responding to them, delivering results from them, and making sure they know that I'm going to stand up to this president. That is what people want from our candidates up and down the ticket for every office. I'm going to deliver that as Secretary of State, and I'm going to work together with all of our other nominees to make sure we win in November.
While I have you, I do want to ask about AI and data centers. You were a former software engineer,
Yes,
I understand. Yes. Would you support a moratorium on more data centers?
Look, I'm the only software engineer who's elected statewide in America right now, and I will be as Secretary of State. And we need to make sure that these companies don't come in and bully our communities. What makes me as upset as the data centers and their environmental impact and the concerns that are real about that is the fact that these are some of the biggest, richest, wealthiest companies with some of the smartest people, but their tactic is bullying small communities and punking them into taking data centers. That is not acceptable. They need to respect the people that live in these communities where they want to put their huge buildings and listen to what they want and their concerns instead of being so arrogant. Like it's an illustration of how corporate power bullies people, and that is unacceptable. We live in a democracy where voters should get to choose how we move forward, not what's happened just with corporations' will.
So you think there should be a ban then? I
think we should really make sure that those citizens are not coming to our communities by bullying.
Lieutenant Governor, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.